Hello everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, doctoral student in psychology, and with me is Mr. Norman Gayford, professor of English and philosophy. Space is a vast canvas, blank except for the random sprinkling of stars. Yet if we look up in the sky, we can find familiar shapes. Constellations that our ancestors believe affected our lives in some way. Now we know better. Each star in a constellation is immeasurably far away from one another and moving in different directions. Humans as self-conscious beings have an interesting quirk. We're so smart that sometimes we see stars and think we know more than there is to know. And other times, we look at the vast emptiness of space and question whether there's anything to know at all. Today, we're looking at epistemology.
Well, there you go with the metaphor again.
I'm still trying to sneak them in. So, epistemology, continuing on our little series here, looking at the pillars of philosophy, or the core elements of it, working our way up from things that are sort of personal into more general and more encompassing and vast. So, epistemology, what is it?
It's a cluster of things that are related. To start at the root, episteme or episteme means knowledge. So epistemology is a theory or sets of theories about how we, it concerns itself with how we think we have knowledge. What are the presuppositions of knowledge? What's the basis for saying that we know something? And how reliable is it? And how can we determine the reliability? And so it's really a set of wonderful questions, all about that idea of trying to find justified true belief.
Yeah, and I'm sure that a lot of listeners are already seeing how this can be a sticky situation, right? How do you know that you know something? And to add on to that, there's even a field of meta-epistemology, which is what do you think about how you know something? So when we think about this, one of the other pillars of philosophy is logic, right? How do we differentiate between the philosophical notions of epistemology and logic?
One of the ways is that, and it's good that you brought that up because it has connections to others of the pillars too. But one of the ways is to come to recognize that logic and not rationality, but logic in the purest sense is not the only way that we come to knowledge. It's not necessarily a requirement or a first principle of all acquisition of knowledge.
Yeah, because as we were talking about before the episode, I'm taking advanced statistics now for my PhD program, right? So they cover this in the introduction to it. They talk about, you can have an argument that's logical and it can still be wrong, right? Logic doesn't imply rightness or knowing something. It's just something that's put in place that makes sure that arguments make sense. So making sense and being true or untrue or wrong or right or having a knowledge, logic is actually separate from that, right?
Well, it can be, or secondary to it. It can be separate. It can be subsidiary. Think about the idea of using your senses to know things. Well, you can't know everything with your senses too, and then there's a priori and the different kinds of. Do I have direct knowledge or do I have indirect knowledge?
Yeah,
and so. I can ostensibly say that I know that I see a cup of water that you've left for me. But I know that I think I know that it's water because it always has been water. But if I took a sip because I can't see the water there, I might have found cocoa. Although it's unlikely it would have been cocoa because the cup is seemingly plastic and so probably wouldn't hold a hot drink. Okay, but that whole process that I'm just doing, as goofy as it sounds, is epistemic. It is the working one's way toward, I like to think of it as accuracy.
Right.
You know, because we live in a time when truth and false truth are things that are tossed around a lot, and people like to think they have the truth. Well, how about if we think about accuracy? The more we can be accurate, the fewer mistakes we might make. But accuracy requires a capacity to consider yourself inaccurate or wrong, and therefore able to be schooled into, through experience, through formal training and whatever, to want to seek what's most accurate.
Right. Yeah. So looking at logic and epistemology, going back to statistics, right? Another thing that is when you're designing studies, right? There's reliability and validity. Mm-hmm. So you can have something that a test that's reliable but not valid, but if something's valid, it's reliable. And so the way that works in terms of logic and epistemology is the sort of thing. The example they used in the book that I really liked was, if you had a theory of intelligence that said the bigger head you have, the more intelligent you are, and you measured the circumference of people's heads in order to determine their intelligence, is that a reliable test? Most people shout, no, it's not. Yeah. But actually it is. Because the test is reliable because it measures the same thing each time. It measures the same thing. And so the test is reliable. It says, okay, well, if we measure somebody's head, we can say what their intelligence is. But it's not a valid measure because measuring their head doesn't measure their intelligence.
Exactly.
So logic's kind of the same way, right? You can have a logical premise. You can build a logical argument. And that does provide something important. It's a reliable measure of what you're arguing.
If the argument is...
But the validity of the argument can come about. It's not separate from logic. It's not separate from logic, but there's other things that go into knowing.
Exactly, because logic, you want to boil it right down. Logic is the process of making arguments and the process of determining whether those arguments are valid. So really, it's a twofold concern, but it's very narrow. If P, then Q. P, therefore Q. If P, then Q. Q, therefore P. They aren't the same thing. They sound it. They're models.
Yeah.
One works, one doesn't. And so logic is part of coming to understand how an argument is framed, the scaffolding upon which it is built, what is left out or assumed, and so that's what makes it important, but narrow.
Yeah, and it's an important part of philosophy, and we don't talk about it explicitly in a lot of our episodes. This one will be a little bit more, I'm not going to say academic, but we'll dive into the terms and sort of dissect how people do philosophy in this episode. Because it's very important, right? The difference between you and me sitting here and just spouting random opinions versus doing philosophy is following these processes. It's a mathematical equation, right? Like you were saying, if P, equals Q, or if all Q's are P's and this and that, or, going backwards and tracing.
Do I truly know that that's water over there in that container? It's water, right. Of course it is. And you might say, nope, it's not. Well, how do you know that? Because I'm the one that put it there. All right. And we can get into that. Well, what did you put in my cup?
Right.
So wait a minute. That's not the same process as step by step, calmly. Yeah.
And so we'll see. And we also will get into what separates philosophy from science, right? Is science goes through the same process that philosophy does. But you have not things you can prove. Because science doesn't prove things, which is a misconception. But you come to conclusions. You can establish cause and effect in these sorts of things. Whereas philosophy and specifically epistemology, we'll see you're looking at even bigger issues that you really can't come to have that sort of knowledge with. So you're following the processes and seeing where they take you. But things are never as certain in philosophy as they are in science.
Can I take a step sideways into another pillar?
Yeah.
Since you brought this up, because I think that this is a way of connecting all of this. So there are parallels between epistemology, the theory of knowledge, and ethics, because both ask very similar kinds of questions. And both are about universal generalizations, things on the biggest scale, really. Kant was looking for the categorical imperative, and epistemology looks for the things which can be known across humanity, for instance. So the parallel is like this: if in ethics, if it is morally wrong for a person to take an action, and they do so anyway, we sometimes say they are morally blameworthy, or there's a character fault of some kind. If a person has a good reason for believing something, now we're into the epistemology, the first was ethics, for believing a statement, but the person doesn't, then in the absence of any good excuse, we say there is a fault in the person's intellectual capacities.
Yeah, so that's the logic and epistemology thing as well, right?
There's where they're all braiding. Yeah, yes.
Right. So epistemologically, even if you come to the correct conclusion, but you didn't use a logical framework to get there, then you really didn't philosophize correctly. Yeah.
Right. Also, the thing that epistemology and ethics have in common is that neither a principle of either one can't be confirmed by the senses. You can't make an observation and say, "Yep, that was the right moral decision," or "Nope, that wasn't."
Right. Yeah.
People say that all the time, but observationally, there's no evidentiary material that.
Yeah, and this ties into what we were talking about last time.
Yes.
with ethics about, if you say that something is right, there's several different types of right, and you could use the same language in epistemology and ethics. Well, what is right and what is wrong? But they're different types of right and wrong, right? Yeah. But it's still all in there. Right. So let's dive into it a little bit. What can you tell us about propositional, procedural, acquaintance, knowledge, some of these different types?
To me, the commonality is in doing the meta thing, really, and in examining the approach one is taking. I mean, I think that's the simplest terms that I would use for it. How are we approaching figuring out what the facts are? How are we approaching figuring out what knowledge is? And we've already just, we're talking about similar things here, but you can do a very logical, rational, progressional, step-by-step approach, which is often done in education, but I gather is also done in manufacturing. You can have an aha moment, an intuitive approach that would caution you against going a direction that you might not have been going. I'm going to use goofy examples because that's what my head is full of, being a grandpa, okay? So this week, I had the great joy of revisiting a Disney film called Hercules, and bits and pieces seen the whole thing in the week, but certainly not one straight run through because we do lots of other things besides watching movies. But in the quintessential moment when the character of Hades has released the Titans and they're marching across the landscape saying Zeus, Zeus, because they want to kill the king of the gods. And Hades says, nice thought. Turns out that Olympus is the opposite direction because they're marching away from. So the Titans turn around and they start marching. Okay. There was epistemology going on there. Because there had to be a course correction because somebody realized that a bunch of others were not going in the direction that they should be.
Yeah. And again, I'm going to bring it back to my statistics homework again, right?
Mm-hmm.
They talk about types of knowledge, right?
Yeah.
And so at the lowest level, and I'll compare this to my work, right? So you have superstition, which is the lowest level, which is essentially saying, well, I know this machine's going to screw up because it's Monday, right? Then you have intuition, which is, your gut. So if I'm thinking, well, it's a really hot day in here, so I think this press is going to overheat, but I don't have anything to play into it. Then there's knowledge through authority, as if, well, I think that this machine's going to screw up because my engineer says that, this part hasn't been replaced and it needs to. And then there's experimental knowledge, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is, we did just recently. We had a problem. And so we ran an experiment where we took multiple types of different rods that we put in the machine, and we gave a different treatment to each one. Then we put each one through the machine to see which one bonded correctly. And we found out, oh, well, this is what we need to do to get this thing to process correctly. And then we went through it. So those are all different sources of knowledge. And some of those kind of fit into this idea of propositional and procedural and acquaintance epistemology.
Yeah.
Right?
These are methods. You were talking about methods. Reliability is something that one, as you mentioned earlier, seeks. But is the knowledge reliable? Because otherwise, what use does it? What utility does it have? Now, that doesn't mean it's not knowledge, but there's a level of importance. Knowledge that is just interesting, a knowledge that has immediate applicability, and for some people, it's only the applicability or utility. But for others of us, it's, wow, that's really interesting in and of itself. The fact that a red star going supernova, essentially more or less in front of our eyes, which you and I talked about last week too, in a galaxy far, far away, it's fascinating what they found out about it. Is that going to affect my week in the sense of anything that I particularly do? Not on the ground level of Maslow's hierarchy, probably. But it is interesting, and it might cause me to rethink something else. And so knowledge can have a strange kind of intuitive utility, not just step by step. But you're studying education. In education, we know part of the reliability is to track the steps. And you did that with the manufacturing. Yeah.
And so, it's different ways of arriving at knowledge, and they go into saying how, though there's a hierarchy of knowledge, right? Now, it doesn't mean that you can't arrive at knowledge through superstition, right? Because if I say, well, it's Monday, so that machine's going to break. If that machine reliably does break on Mondays, well, that's knowledge through superstition. And there's a good chance that you can dig deeper and find a reasonable explanation.
It's not a causal thing because Monday happened.
Well, it's probably because it's been sitting all weekend. And so something is happening in the machine when it's not being run for 2 days that causes it not to start, right? Or, knowledge through intuition. There's a good chance that, well, I've been doing this for 7 years. So if I think it's too hot, there's a good chance it's probably too hot.
Yep.
Knowledge through authority, right? This engineer's been doing this for 42 years. So if he thinks it's going to break and it does break, then he was an authoritative source. But if he tells me a bunch of things and then they don't come to pass, then maybe he's not, maybe he has some gaps in his knowledge or whatever the case may be. Experimental knowledge, that's the gold standard, because really, if you're running an experiment, if you have an independent variable and a control variable and a dependent variable, and you've isolated a lot of the extraneous or confounding variables, that's about as accurate as you can get. So that's sort of the gold standard. And these are all different ways of arriving at knowledge. So you mentioned it before, and we've talked about it extensively in a couple episodes, but we'll hit on it again. Tell us about a priori and a posteriori.
Knowledge that you gain through experience, or knowledge that you can only have through the measurements and thoughts and so on of others, or in fact that you think lingers from the beginning of time. It's knowledge that is how you access the knowledge, and do you have direct access or indirect access?
Right. So a posteriori is knowledge that you essentially come by through your senses, right?
Yeah.
And then a priori knowledge is any knowledge that you come by not through your senses.
Right. Whether it's by assumption, by having it handed down, by, and it even can involve, in some sense, trusting what others have. Does the Eiffel Tower exist in Paris?
Right.
Well, if I've never gone to Paris and I haven't seen it, do I know that it's there? Well, actually, I do. But how? Because of the photographs other people have taken? How? Because we have building records?
And that's an interesting idea, right? Where do we draw the line between a priori and a posteriori in that regard? Because so is a posteriori, right, only in person seeing the Eiffel Tower, or is using your visual senses to watch a video recording or see a picture, or is that sort? Where do you draw the line with that?
It can be, but well, I think here's another definition. A priori is relating or denoting the reasoning of or knowledge, which proceeds from theoretical deduction rather than observation or experience. Okay. Well, so the Eiffel Tower thing, that's observation. It's others' observation. It's not my immediate experience. I've had an experience of seeing what others have experienced. And there are enough different pieces of data to make that wholly knowledge. So
would you say knowledge of the Eiffel Tower for an average American, would it be accurate to say that that's a posteriori knowledge today, but it would have been a priori knowledge 200 years ago when there wasn't photographs or videos, that sort of thing?
Loosely, yeah. Yeah, I think perhaps.
Because at that point, it's theoretical and it's abstract. Like, you have to rely on other people's telling you about it, but you've never actually seen it.
No, I'm going to back up. No, it's still a posteriori, because you're reasoning from that which has been established. Okay. So 200 years ago, you don't have photographs, but people have told you of whatever it is, the Acropolis. Or it won't stick with the Eiffel Tower, but it has been standing along with the Colosseum. All right. Postcards were made of it. But even before postcards, people wrote of it back to when it was first built. So that's still observations or experiences that deductive reasoning has proceeded from. Some observations have been made. So the kind of observation, the technical support differs and advances.
Man, that raises a whole host of interesting questions then, because thinking sort of, let's think cosmologically, right? So what sort of things, I mean, we have this knowledge based off of our telescopes looking at the cosmic microwave background, these sorts of things about, the origins of the universe and how things have proceeded. Mm-hmm. So that would make a lot of that a posteriori knowledge, right?
Yeah.
So what sort of things would still be a priori knowledge in our day and age, do you think?
Things that you can't measure. Things that are still, I mean, I'm being cautious because I'm just sifting really fast. To my knowledge, we haven't seen dark matter yet. It's still theoretical. Theoretical doesn't mean it's weak. It just means that there are all kinds of good reasons intellectually to posit that it's there, but we don't have we have indirect observation of gravitational anomalies and so on, but we don't have the direct observation.
Right. Okay.
I think that works.
Yeah, that makes sense. And a lot of, all right, yeah, sort of abstract theoretical concepts. I mean, we've talked about it the last few weeks in like axiology and stuff, artwork, or subjective emotions, these sorts of things. But yeah, if we're talking about knowledge, we are talking about something that's still measurable, but just theoretical or abstract, right?
Yeah, mathematically measurable, but not through the immediacy of the senses.
Okay. Can you explain the regress problem for the listeners?
In an epistemological sense, I think make sure I'm on the same page with you. So doing your due diligence on the provenance of the knowledge. What step was taken before? Where does it originate?
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
And so the regress problem is that you can perhaps hypothetically think your way back to the first grunting decision made by the Neanderthal. We talked about Neanderthals too. The Homo sapiens who developed. We can't know absolutely who spoke the first word, for instance. But we know that the first word had to have been spoken because language developed. But we regress back through, we can project. And some things we can regress back through if it's a couple of generations, perhaps, of a problem to the beginning of a technology that we still have evidence of. Is that?
Yeah, no, that's right on. And so that has a wide range of problems. So it's the regress problem for epistemological knowledge, right? I think that the example they used on Wikipedia was humans, right? So if this person is a human, well, what makes him a human? Well, every person born from a human female is a human. Well,
yep.
At some point, you have to go back far enough that there was a person that wasn't born from a human female, unless people always existed since the beginning of time. Yeah. And you can get much more metaphysical with it, going all the way up, again, back to cosmology, right? And this is something that people struggle with conceptually when they think about this sort of thing. And it's probably the origins of many religions, right? Yeah. Is this idea, and I've done a lot of reading on it this week, actually, about the origin of the universe. Mm-hmm. And if you go back, you keep asking the question and you keep trying to establish what knowledge your current knowledge is built on. And you keep going back and back and back and back. Well, is there ever a point where you can't go back any farther? The regress problem is that idea of being unable to.
Infinite regression, right? And it's actually one of Zeno's paradoxes. I think if you take a look, can I cut something in half and then a quarter and then
right.
It's not exactly the same thing, but that brought that to mind for me. It's useful in the sense of trying to establish authority. It's useful in the sense of trying to be accurate. So we have the Webb Space Telescope, which is probably going to tell us more about the age and origin of the universe, because it's going to be able to see regressively further back in time because of the way that light works. So things that we think we know now inductively will probably change or possibly change. I won't even say probably, although generally the more observation is done, the more change happens. So that's a useful application of regression, which is right in front of our technical eyes, our technologically enhanced eyes. And if you want to trace back, I suppose if you want to do a sociological thing regressively, and you trace back an idea to where you think it might have begun, and if it began in a really unauthoritative source and somehow it's gained all this authority, there's another word for that, which is skeptically inquiring or debunking things. And so it has some use. It has interesting applications. I just said skepticism. Skepticism is really so much part of epistemology.
Yeah. And we'll talk about it a little bit later.
Okay.
But I think that we definitely need to do a whole episode on skepticism, because there's just a lot to talk about there. But yeah, so looking at epistemology, this regress problem, or this idea of, and this is where we get philosophy being different from science in that regard, right? Is that philosophy is going to go, science is going to leave. It's going to wash its hands, right? It's going to say, hey, listen, like this is outside of what we can deal with. So we're not going to address it. We're just going to deal with the things that we can experimentally, like we were talking about, that golden standard of being able to isolate variables. This is what we're going to say that we know. This is our standard for knowing. Epistemology is going a little bit further and saying, well, philosophy, it's the job of philosophy to push the boundaries of science in order to sort of, we're sort of hacking down the weeds so that science can build a road here eventually, right? So we need to use logic, and we need to use observation, and we need to follow these sorts of things.
That's the rationalist strain.
But we also need to confront this glaring problem that if we are saying that we know something now, and then we're trying to find out what the foundational knowledge of this is, but the more we look at the foundational knowledge, we get to a point in the past where we can no longer identify what the foundational knowledge is. We need to come up with a solution for that problem. Do you want to cover some of the solutions that philosophy has for that?
Yeah, and I'll try to avoid skepticism because you want to talk about that later. But I'm going to start with what works most for me as an individual thinking human being. It's useful to know the foundations of anything because you can't theorize about your work, like teaching, without understanding where some of those ideas came. You can do it, but you're doing it rather randomly and chaotically, haphazardly, because you don't follow where things came from. Going to another metaphor that we've gone to before, building a house. Well, we know the great teacher once said you don't build a house on sand. Okay, well, that's fine. But you can build with many kinds of foundations. But if you sort of put part of a foundation in and say, no, I'm going to build the wall on that, then I'm going to put some more foundation in, you're probably not going to have a structure that is nearly as well built as it could be. So for me, it's always, or mostly, about the idea of establishing the verifiable and probable not certitude, but near certainty that under ordinary conditions that building would stand. But things pop up, things happen that one doesn't expect. And I think that epistemology, when you follow the step by step, even regressively or forwardly, both directions, you are likely to arrive at things that might be shared with others that would help them when they begin to encounter a problem, which had to be addressed in retroactive fashion in one's own experience. I have a geothermal system in our house. We put it in last year. We wanted it to be green. I'm glad that we did it. But in the intensive cold, I found that one of the zones is not able to keep up with sub-zero temperatures. And that thus brings down the temperature of the other zones because it's trying to crank so hard to equalize things. I'm sure they told me, but I don't remember that. Unlike intuitively, when you have zones for different kinds of heating and you can set them to different temperatures, geothermal machinery requires the same zone temperature, a universal zone temperature. And epistemology is about universal things. So I'm going to have to retroactively go back and make decisions about whether we put in different, and I don't want to get too micro about this, but I could tell somebody else, this is something you very much want to be very careful about if you have an old house, to have them assess the space. And it's a fairly new technology, and so they're still inductively working through some of the problems too. So that can be, it can be useful to somebody. It's certainly useful to me because now I've got decisions to make about whether, how one approaches the problem. So I have the knowledge, so to speak. I've had the established facts of the temperatures and the square footage. And so there's more than one way to approach it. Space heaters, which chew up energy, or, is that addressing?
Yeah. So we were talking about how the regress problem is addressed in philosophy. Yes. And I think that there's different ways of doing it, right? I think that there's sort of this cutoff where a posteriori knowledge changes to a priori knowledge. Yeah. So the example that I'm thinking of is there's a story, a myth that Plato wanted to know how many teeth a horse had in its mouth. So he thought about the horse's mouth, and Aristotle said, well, I'm just going to go count the teeth, right? Yes. And so that sort of demonstrates an a posteriori versus an a priori method of obtaining knowledge. I think where the regress problem gets sticky is when that a posteriori knowledge is no longer you can't access it. So let's say the horse is behind a fence that you can't enter. Yeah. So the horse is 30 feet away. Yeah. So you can't get to the horse, but you can look at it. You could probably still arrive at a rough estimate of how many teeth it has if you say, okay, well, its head is this big from this distance. So if I do the math, then its head is actually this big in real life. And, if I'm assuming that the teeth have this sort of proportion and, you have this sort of stuff, I'm guessing it has this many teeth. So that's sort of an a posteriori knowledge. Is it going to be or an a priori knowledge? Is it going to be as accurate as the a posteriori? No. And that's where some of these problems with the regress problem get interesting. Is a lot of our knowledge is built off of something where you don't know the initial conditions.
That is exactly it. This is why epistemology. There are those in epistemologists who will say that this you've lived on it. That it is not concerned with why people believe that horse has X number of teeth, or how they came to believe that in the first place. That's not what epistemology is about. It's about finding a particular, if you know something, are you justified in making a claim? If you think you know something and you make a claim, is it justifiable in the circumstances that you're working on? So would it be justifiable to say a horse has teeth and you're looking at it from 30 feet away? Probably. Would it be justifiable to say, well, I can extrapolate from other head sizes and so on? Yes, knowing, as you just said, that it's not going to be 100% reliable. But you come to levels of justification of the strength of a claim. So the claim has to be adjusted to what you have to work with.
Right. And that's the fundamental difference between science and philosophy, right? Is you can't design an experimental condition, yes. But using logic and using some of your other tools in your toolbox, you can come to some type of knowledge rather than just saying, well, that horse has 32 teeth because I have 32 teeth. Right? You're not saying that. You're saying, okay, well, I'm making observations. I'm doing some work here to try to come to an answer that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And this is still happening today in a lot of different areas. Cosmology is my favorite one. Roger Penrose, and his idea of a cyclical universe, and how the mathematics fits. That one's fascinating to me because mathematically, a very hot, dense universe and a very diffuse, cold universe have the same mathematical properties. So in Penrose's theory, what will happen is as dark energy continues to spread everything out from each other, and stars run out of fuel, and nothing can gravitationally hold together in order to create any new fusion, right? Everything turns black, and then black holes eat everything up, and then black holes evaporate, and eventually you have nothing really except a diffuse energy throughout the universe. But paradoxically, that's the exact same state as the Big Bang, this hot, dense universe. And so his theory is that as the universe continues to expand and get colder, eventually time and space and perspective itself disappears. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like you're zooming out, right? You're zooming out on this universe getting bigger and colder and farther away. But then eventually, all of a sudden, you've zoomed out far enough that it's a tiny hot speck again and it starts over, right?
Yeah.
And mathematically, this works, right?
It's fascinating.
Yeah. And but there's other explanations as well. There's I think it's the waveform function of the universe, which is quantum mechanic, that says essentially everything is just a wave function, right? And so when you get these spooky actions at a distance, these quantumly entangled things, basically what it's saying is just the whole universe is just a wave, right? And the whole thing is just one wave. We're a wave. Everything is just this wave, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's this underlying thing, and the probabilities are what cause these various events to happen. So this is all a priori knowledge, right? We can't design an experiment to prove it. We can't use our senses to observe it, but mathematically, logically, we can describe it, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there's multiple explanations, right? And so the difficult part of philosophy is saying, the difficult part of being a human is saying, I don't know, and I'm never gonna know. Yeah. But the fun part of it is looking at all of these possibilities and thinking, you know what? This could be something that actually happened. You know?
There's the humility. We always come back to this. Any one of us has moments of arrogance, highly wrecked emotionality, which defies reason and humility sometimes. But to be able to say, why do I think that I know? What is my justification for this? That's really where you work out from. That's where you can regressively go backward to where did you hear it? Where did you hear it? And then you can say, oh, wait a minute. Let's take something a lot of people say, at least around where we live. I grew up with this. I still hear it day after day. Almost literally day after day. Bad things always happen in threes. Mm. You've heard this, right?
Yeah.
Right. And I remember going back decades asking this question of people and never getting a particularly satisfying answer. Bad things always happen in threes. So what? Let's suppose they do. Is that going to give you an opportunity to discern from the first two things that happen what the third one is? Because usually when people list a string, this person died, this terrible thing happened to my car, so something else is going to happen. Oh, good. So you're going to sit and twiddle your thumbs and shiver from sheer trepidation. I just know something's going to happen. Well, Chicken Little knew the sky was going to fall too, and so it's not useful. What good is it to say things happen? Is it to verify that, gee, we know this because my grandmother told me this, because her grandmother told me this, and therefore it must be so?
Right. And what reliable measurement are we using to track this? What period of time has to elapse? What magnitude of bad do we have to consider?
And does it have to be any magnitude? Can it be any magnitude at all?
Right.
I cut my finger. Somebody died, and the car blew up.
Right.
And whatever other things might have happened that were also descriptively bad sort of go, no, those three we focus on.
So this kind of leads us into the question, can skepticism ever be truly dismissed?
I don't think it can be, and I don't think it should be. I think that's what my education has taught me in philosophy and the humanities in general. The pre-Socratics skepticism wasn't really an issue. And I bring them up because I was thinking about this. I scribbled a note about this, getting ready for today. Let's see if I can find it. But Heraclitus. Okay, we talk about the river and all. Right? We don't doubt the use of Parmenides used the sense, said we have reason, and Heraclitus said we use our senses, but they didn't doubt that knowledge of reality was possible. That's really the crux. Way back, they thought, yeah, we can figure reality out. And if we fast forward somewhat into the 5th century BC, we have the sophists who we've talked about this, who questioned nature's objectivity, who questioned therefore the objectivity of knowledge to some extent, and Protagoras, who said man is the measure of all things, so appearances are the only reality, and we have since learned. So we have all of these things. Skepticism leads to epistemology. You need skepticism in order to have epistemology, and the job of warranting and making balancing out the claims you're making and how those are supported with what you find. That's a constant challenge that skepticism brings. If somebody says, I challenge that, fine, science says bring it on, and we'll show you all the evidence. Where we have fallen apart egregiously in our own culture in this time in which we're doing these podcasts is to me, speaking as one person, speaking for you, is that skepticism has come to mean having an alternative, ultimate truth that can't be defined, modified, broken down, or educated because it just is so, because I want it to be so, and therefore it's so. And no amount of rationality can assail that or teach it out of itself.
Yeah, much like the state of a cold, diffuse universe being the same as a state of a hot, dense universe, being skeptical, being the ultimate skeptic, essentially is the same state as being somebody who considers all knowledge to be concrete, right? Like the two polar opposites actually form a circle, right? There's this they connect. Yeah, and that's
why are you skeptical about this? Okay, I accept your skepticism. Give me a reason why you're skeptical about it. I can in some way address that. If you won't consider how it's being addressed, then you don't really want to have your skepticism lead to anything, but under certainty. And epistemology is not about certainty. and philosophy is not about certainty. Thinking is not about certainty for the most part. And so what are you going to do with it?
Yeah, I'm really satisfied with the way you answered that question, because every once in a while I set you up. I'll word a question in such a way that I'm leading you one direction, and every single time you get it right. You always go the other direction. One of these times you're going to have a bad day and you're going to be real mad at me when.
But one of the times I'm going to what?
No, but that was a great answer, because skepticism, we can word it as being a bad thing, but skepticism is really it's a high trait to have. True skepticism, which is that state of questioning you know, what do we know, and where did this knowledge come from? But like you said, in our societal dealings, lots of times we come across sort of false skepticism, which is this something that parades as being questioning, but really it's sort of a false guise for an already established position on something.
Right. Somebody says they cannot communicate with a mask. I've encountered that this week. Tears the mask off. I can't talk in this thing. And I told you before the recording, my thought was, well, then I hope you're not a doctor, an EMT, a firefighter, a radiologist, because all of them seem to be able to communicate with various kinds of masks and tools. So what you're really saying is, I don't wanna.
Right.
And so you assert a falsehood, which is that you can't talk or you can't communicate, which is clearly falsifiable by demonstrable moment to moment with millions of people, including choirs who sing intelligible verse. So I think that's where skepticism, as you just said, when skepticism is false, when the skepticism is not skepticism, but a cloak for wanting to be utterly certain that you're right because you are, that's dangerous.
Yeah, so we've gotten to an interesting sort of paradox here, right? Where, like I said earlier in the episode, science never proves anything, right? It can disprove some things, but it can't prove anything. And you mentioned how a lot of these things, in epistemology things, it's not about knowing, right? But that's what's sort of what it is. So we've reached this strange paradox. So what are the big questions in epistemology facing us? Are they the same as the ones in the past, or what sort of progress are we making in this pursuit of knowledge?
I think I was listing of some questions. Well, go back to what we said before. What is the rational basis for regarding a principle or a standard or an idea proper? What has led their regressive to that? That's one of the questions. Oh my gosh, how does one define proper? How does one define reliable? How does one define factuality? I'm just rattling the questions. Those are all built in to the relationship between skepticism and epistemology, because we accept that while we have come to a certain position now, new information inductively may cause us to alter the course. And so epistemology, well applied as a living process, can lead one to be more amenable to change. Well, you might think, well, wait a minute, it's about establishing facts. Yes, but not for all eternity. It's about establishing universal facts. Yes, as best as we can know them at that moment. Right. So there's always the qualified.
Yeah. And so that's a perfect description of the marriage between skepticism and epistemology, right? And it doesn't change that there is a paradox, right? No. Epistemology is this philosophical notion of establishing knowledge, but built into establishing knowledge is this this characteristic of skepticism, which is questioning. What
is knowledge? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Without the questioning, you can't actually come to know anything. Plato, it goes back to him again. Whatever we may think about, we think we know about him as a person. What is knowledge? Where is knowledge found? How much of what we think we know is really knowledge? Do senses supply knowledge? Can reason supply knowledge? What is the relation between knowledge and true belief? These are the questions that Plato was asking. And we still are wrestling with every one of those we did today. Yeah. Yeah, so it's been a good episode. We didn't head where I expected at all. I have a bunch of questions that I didn't ask, and a bunch of questions that I did ask that weren't on the paper. But I liked it because it was a little bit more of an academic discussion than we normally have, and I don't think that it would turn anybody off. I'm hoping that people found it pretty interesting, and to kind of see some sort of the more formal and structural elements of philosophy and how it's conceived, as opposed to just hearing us talk and thinking, well, these just two guys, saying whatever they think is coming to their mind, that sort of thing. But so yeah, we'll continue. And the fact that we didn't go through everything, and the fact that skepticism is a huge topic on its own means we'll definitely be revisiting this in the future, probably the near future. But until next time, keep pondering.